been 40 years and we still don't quite know.
You're listening to The Cosmic Cast. Hello and welcome to another episode of The Cosmic Cast. I'm John Panay-Fisher. This week, joining me is Elliot Carter.
Hello.
Marissa Lowe.
Hello.
And from the University of Cardiff is Marc-Alban Millet.
Hello.
How's it going?
Very good, thank you. How about you guys?
Not too bad, thanks. It's a real pleasure to have you on. So you've just come off doing a seminar here at Manchester, and you were telling us a bit about stable isotopes. You're a stable isotope geochemist, that'd be fair to say.
am, yeah.
So what are stable isotopes and why are they so interesting?
So all chemical elements have a range of isotopes, which are essentially atoms with a slightly different set of neutrons and protons. And what is very interesting in them is that basically, these isotopes of different elements will have the same chemical properties, but very, very minor differences in their physical properties. And so what you can do is actually use those isotopes and their relative abundance to actually inform how geological processes happen and their nature, and basically try to inform what we know about the Earth through that.
What would you say? So I guess there's a whole range of different stable isotopes, and some we've touched on a bit in the past on this podcast, but what would you say your favourite stable isotope is?
Well, it has to be titanium now. So titanium has been my focus of research for the last few years now, and the main reason why I was really interested in it is that it's an element that has a fairly boring chemical behaviour, which make it slightly more easy to interpret. It was basically boring to the point of excitement, I guess. Yeah.
Because it's quite interesting, I guess, this explosion of new different isotopic systems that have sort of occurred in the past decade, I guess.
It's great, and it's when you look at this history of geochemistry, actually, which is not that old. It's a field that arrived about 100 years ago now, and it's been really driven by technological advances. So about these 20 years ago, there was this new generation of mass spectrometers, which are the godless machine that we use in the laboratories to measure these isotope compositions. And so they enabled us really to measure so many more elements for their isotopic composition. And it's since then it's been the race essentially between different labs to try and measure better and more. Yeah. So titanium was one of those that needed to be done.
So what drew you to titanium in the first place? Was it a specific question you wanted to address that only titanium could provide the answer for?
So my background was more in technical development.
Right.
So I had come up from a previous postdoc in New Zealand. And I arrived in Chicago, and I had done iron isotopes. And one of the complications with iron isotopes was that it had a chemical behavior that was not easily disentangled. There had many properties there that we could not. So the idea was that I went to Chicago and I started working with this person called Nicolas Dauphas. And we're like, okay, well, we need to simplify things a bit. And titanium is probably a good one for that, and no one has done it. So I had this background in technical development, which was required to do this, and we had basically this question, and I was all right, okay, let's go for it. It took about a year and a half of development, of making sure that we knew what we were doing, try to measure, and then since then it's been 5 years of just these refining question, understanding how isotopes of titanium fractionate in nature. It's a learning curve, definitely.
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool.
Mm-hmm. So what different geological processes are you hoping to study using titanium?
So the main one is continent formation. This is the thing that excites me the most in there. But mainly what I really want to do is actually try to link evolution of the Earth's surface to evolution of planetary interiors, and how these two are linked. And continent formation is one of the big questions in there that you have to answer if you want to try to understand that prior question. So that is what I'm trying to do, and I think titanium has a really big role to play in this. And there's actually, you're onto something that is a good idea when other groups are also trying to do the same thing. There's a lot of smart people around, and good ideas don't happen in isolation. So it's good.
I guess the continental crust formation question is fascinating. I suppose it's one of these big questions that no one really has a firm answer for yet.
No, it's been heavily debated in there, and because there are many difficulties in there. First of all, it's actually getting samples because there are not that many of them. Of
course, yeah.
And so that's really hard to say, but they're actually in very hard places to look at, and it's difficult to go there. The Australian outback is actually not easy to go to. Wonderful places, but yeah, quite hard to get to. So. These are questions that are difficult to answer for partly that reason. Also, we have a problem of preservation.
Mm-hmm.
Old rocks don't tend to get preserved; they get eroded, they get weathered. So these are not samples that are easy to actually just access, and there's not that many of them.
Yeah.
And then finally, you need the geochemical tools. So we need to have well understood set of geochemical tools to basically understand these questions.
Because I guess when we for listeners perhaps may not be too familiar, when we talk about these old bits of continental crust, we're talking about rocks that are 3.5 billion years old.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about. Yeah, 2.5 and older.
And they're found in these, I guess, so-called cratonic areas. So these are areas like South Africa,
mm-hmm.
like Canada, like Siberia, like Australia, like you just mentioned.
Australia, yeah. So South Africa with what we call the Cap Val Craton, which is quite accessible. Western Australia, quite difficult to access. This is, you need to be able to go and camping for weeks on end.
Mm-hmm.
And Northern Canada, it's accessible maybe half of the year only.
Yeah, sure.
And you need to go by helicopter. Greenland, same idea. Siberia, probably the same thing as well. So these are areas that are not readily accessible.
That's some cool field work then.
That's a very cool field work. I spent very much thank you to the Geological Survey of Western Australia that enabled that fieldwork in Australia that we did for a full month of fieldwork in Pilbara and Yilgarn Cratons last October. That was absolutely amazing.
So is Australia quite well studied for its cratonic material? I guess you hear a lot about things like, as you say, South Africa in the literature, but
it is quite well studied, and it's mainly thanks to the huge effort by the Geological Survey of Western Australia. So these are people that have just been mapping it in huge details over the last decades or so. They have done this huge amount of work on that, and credit to them. Also, double credit to them. Actually, they are very keen on open science. Mm-hmm. So all their results are actually completely open, and that's massive great. Kudos to them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why when we got in touch and then we asked them, okay, well, can you help us actually do this sampling? Mm-hmm. And our idea was actually to create these open sample sets. Mm-hmm. down the line so that people could request and we would curate. Yeah. But people could request so that we can finally look into the petrology and the geochemistry of Archean rocks on a set of samples, a really common set of samples. Yeah. They were absolutely, super game with it, and they really helped us massively for that.
I mean, that's a brilliant idea, really. I'm surprised no one's thought of that ages ago to try.
It is coming down to competition, I guess. Yeah. It's but I think this is the way forward for us to try to make a lot of progress on this question, is that we need to have these open sample sets.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting sort of wider point in general, isn't it, about academia, I suppose, that it'd be so much better if we could all collaborate a bit more and perhaps be less competitive into labs sometimes.
Well, I guess that you can see it from another point of view, is that there's only so many samples and so many elements you can measure. So you're always going to create a bit of competition. But it's friendly. Most of the time, it's actually quite nice.
No, sure. Right?
Yeah. So when you're going around in the field and sampling, is it difficult to get a piece of rock and be like, this is representative of the continental crust?
That is, it's quite funny because as I stope geochemist, mainly when we are essentially glorified lab rats, when you see a powder. And so powder is a powder. It looks the same as the next one. It's probably a bit whiter or a bit grayer. But actually, in the field, when you have to make the decision that this is a good sample, then it starts going to be work. So this is why as well, we ended up with about 10 of us with different skills. So there was isotope geochemists, there was structural geologists, there were metamorphic petrologists, mappers, geology field mappers, and then we all got together to decide this is the best sample in this location. This is what is representative of what's happening here. And so that was I think this is a powerful approach, and I'm really looking forward to actually get this forward in the future.
So how did you actually organize that? Is this a bunch of people or is it a bigger project?
So I guess we started doing this work in South Africa, and the same team, in its vast majority, went back to Australia. And so that was through a NUC grant that I got to work on continent formation. And part of this had to, we had to do the fieldwork in the Cap Vert craters because we could not secure the samples in another way. So I contacted this French person, Jean-François Moyen, and who's an expert in the Cap Vert geology. So contacted him, and turned out that he had been contacted by another isotope geochemist based in Melbourne, and called Oliver Nebel. And so basically he said, well, you know what, guys, how about we do go all together? And then that's when we started actually, no, this is the way to go.
Okay.
It's we basically took on from there.
That's really cool. So then you get these rocks from Australia, and you've gone back to the lab, and then you've got to cut through billions of years worth of history.
So that's the downside of old rocks, is that they tend to be quite weathered.
Yeah.
The ones in Australia are actually very well preserved, fortunately for us. But yes, what you end up having to do is cut the alteration crust off, and then polish them to make sure that the soil doesn't contaminate the rocks, and then you smash them to a powder. So that has to be happening in very controlled environment to make sure that you do not contaminate those rocks, and that you actually preserve the geochemical signature that you are interested in.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you love about being in the lab, doing these sorts of geochemical measurements?
It's for me, chemistry has always been something that spoke to me, I guess, from high school onwards. It's like the playing with chemical elements and thinking about them. And mainly for me, that's the mass spectrometry side of things. It's a big machine. It's something that I quite enjoy. After that, there's the lab part of it where you actually painstakingly digest and separate elements from each other using chemical processes. That's not something that I would say I enjoy the most about this process, but it's still something that I'm still happy to do. For me, that was mainly the mass spectrometry side of things. That's one of the things that really excite me.
Yeah.
It is exciting watching data come in.
It is. Getting numbers from rocks is quite cool.
Exactly. It is.
So what are the main instruments that you use to analyze your samples?
So the main thing I use is mass spectrometry and mainly plasma source mass spectrometry. So it's these big instruments that generate a plasma in which you inject your sample. All the elements in there get ionized and accelerated into this mass spectrometer, which is then going to basically separate your isotopes according to their mass, and that's going to enable you to detect each of them and measure their relative abundance, which is what we are looking into. And this relative abundance is transformed into a ratio, which is what we are after. This is what we always talk about isotope ratios, essentially. So I do this for isotopes, but I also look at trace elements, so basically just measuring the straight concentration of elements in rocks. And for that, we use also these smaller mass spectrometers. And so that's the two kind of machines that we have in the lab in Cardiff. Yeah.
So what sort of abundances of these isotopes and trace elements are you working with here?
So titanium fortunately is in weight percent, so fairly abundant rock. But sometimes when we look at, for example, elements like strontium or neodymium, which are very informative on their own, we are looking at what we call ppm. So that would be a millionth of a gram per gram of rock. So that's very, very small concentration. So when we try to purify them, it's kind of key that those processes have to be very well calibrated. They are quite painstaking because you are trying to separate essentially atoms for billions of other atoms.
It's quite cool.
Really. It's a cool process, but it is kind of we are looking very much for a needle in a haystack there.
So you get all this data, and I guess it'd be quite good to talk a bit about some of the bigger questions then. I mean, so continental crust formation, I guess there are two main models, aren't there?
Yeah. So you have two these like end-membered models, I guess, that are, one of them is you form continents in an oceanic plateau or a plume type environment, so mantle plumes, and you form these oceanic plateaus at the surface of the Earth.
So there'll be just thick stacks of basalt, effectively.
Yeah, thick stacks of basalts, and then they get thicker and thicker, and then they get so thick that the bottom of it is going to start melting and making these granites that are going to form the continents in the end. The other model is that what you have is akin to a subduction zone,
Yeah.
where you have a plate that actually goes down back in the mantle, and it gets too hot for it when it starts to sink in the mantle, starts to melt, and make those granites. These are the two end member models. And essentially, what we have been trying to do is differentiate between these two models in the record.
Yeah.
It's been 40 years, and we still don't quite know. So there's a lot of progress that's been made. But yeah, it is trying to refine when which happened, and could they both have happened at the same time? Was one more dominant than another at any point in time?
Yeah. And is there sort of a consensus starting to emerge throughout the community as to which is better, or is it emerging that it is both
I think,
together?
A few years ago, I would say, yes, there's a sort of a few arguments that were starting to be laid out towards a switch from the plume type model before 3 billion years ago to a switch towards the subduction zone model after 3 billion years ago, which was decided, well, okay, that's the onset of plate tectonics essentially on Earth. So that was the concept a few years ago. I think now it's a bit more confused. There's some of the proxies that were used to lay out this interpretation have been now starting to be questioned now.
Yeah.
But I think there is clearly something that happens 3 billion years ago.
Yeah.
That would be my personal view. As to exactly what it is now, question still remains open.
Yeah, yeah. And then I guess you were mentioning about linking this to habitability then. So I guess that ties in with things like the great oxidation events and all that kind of stuff.
The key question that we all try to answer as geologists is, why is there life? And, why is there life on Earth is the biggest question in those sciences. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
Well, planetary science too, I guess, even. I mean, thinking about Mars and...
Absolutely. But we have to start with something that, if we don't understand on Earth, it's going to be difficult to understand it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So that is, to me, the biggest question. What we also know is that Earth is the only planet with plate tectonics on it. So the question that is evident from this is, are the two linked?
Mm-hmm. So what might the link be between?
So what the thing is that you need to have life. You need to have volatile and bioavailable elements available at the surface. So you need to have this cycle of these are ultimately extracted from the mantle by volcanism. Okay, but you cannot just keep on depleting the mantle either. Okay, because otherwise your planet would die. So you need to have established what we call these global geochemical cycles, and to do that, you need to have planetary dynamics. You need to have your planet needs to be dynamic for that. So, and then one way to do that is plate tectonics. So if you want to answer the question of planetary habitability, you need to be able to understand planetary dynamics.
I guess it's sustained planetary habitability as well, isn't it, I suppose?
Yes.
Because you might imagine a situation on Mars where you've got some volcanic activity and maybe something
and it dies out.
But
yes.
dies out.
So no, you need to have it sustainable over long periods of time. Absolutely.
So essentially you're storing a bit of water and other things you need for life inside.
Yeah.
So they don't all get depleted.
Yeah. So you need to have this stability of these sustainable over hundreds of millions and billions of years. So one way to do that is to have plate tectonics.
Yeah, that's really cool. I guess it's a link that not many people really talk about, I suppose.
I think it's something that is discussed for sure, but maybe it's not as taught as it should be.
Yes, yeah.
So that's why part of the courses I've designed actually in Cardiff actually always building habitable planets. That's whatever I'm trying to do as well. And that's I think it's important that all the research that you do actually has to be transferred into your teaching at some stage. And
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating.
So I guess bringing it back to titanium, what are you, on this bigger question of when continental formation happened, what are you seeing from the titanium isotope point of view?
My thinking would be that what we can do with titanium is trace the involvement of this pressure-sensitive mineral, which is called rutile, in the generation of continent formation, and that in itself, having the information about the presence of rutile or not during continent formation, can actually help us differentiate between these two models of oceanic plateau versus subduction zone. And what the results we have so far with my group is that what we would see is that actually there's probably a lot, both oceanic plateau and subduction zone early in Earth history, and then after that it kind of normalizes towards more the subduction zone model. So that would be for us this transition between a fairly chaotic, I guess,
Okay.
surface dynamic and planetary dynamics. And then after that, we just normalize to a more common process of making continents. That to me would be the onset of plate tectonics. That's the way I would view it now. And so that's the way I see it.
So I guess because you were mentioning earlier, I guess, about how you don't necessarily need plate tectonics to start subduction.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you envisage that happening on Earth then?
I am no planetologist, but yeah, we having local subductions,
Yeah.
which we seem to have example of in Venus, and whether that is started by impacts, for example,
Yeah.
or simply because you have a mantle plume hitting the surface, making a heavy object on the crust surface, and then that would create some tension on the edges and potentially start some very localized subduction around it. So this plume-induced subduction, that would be another way of making
It's almost like a tear that starts to facilitate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the thing is that, you can, an interesting way of looking at it would be potentially how many tears do you need in a stagnant lid, essentially, to actually start having them joining together and making interconnected plate boundaries. That's I think.
I seem to remember reading some papers about some of the subduction zones around Java. People suggest that it's quite a shallow subduction. It might be some sort of tear in the lithosphere. Would that be a sort of an analog?
Potentially, yeah. There's it's always difficult to talk about modern Earth analogs of early Earth.
Yeah.
So it is always that. But I'm sure there's something that we can learn from it. So absolutely, yeah.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so it sounds like the early Earth is, in many ways, quite unrecognizable to what we know today.
I think there's a lot that we can learn from modern analogs. But yeah, it's always going to be difficult to say, yeah, all right, this happened that way and it's still happening today like this. That is not going to happen. These are sometimes these overclaims that are being made that are a bit dangerous for us. Yeah.
But it must have been quite a barren landscape, I guess, just standing there with these small rocky bits in the middle of these vast oceans. That must have been quite cool.
And then especially I think of this field work in Pilbara, where actually even the geology there is completely different.
Yeah.
So what we are used to in modern Earth is actually these fairly long, elongated structures, shear zones that are linear structures or semi-linear structures, I guess, that are extend over hundreds of kilometers. The eastern Pilbara in particular, which is this region of the Pilbara Craton, which is 3.5 billion years old. Even on Google Earth, you can actually see it. The geology is completely different. We have this, what we call this domain keel structure, where essentially you have these, circular zones of regions of granites, where granites are just intruded into each other. And what you have on the edge is these, what we call these greenstone belts, which are mainly basalts, which are, dipping vertically. And it's just all around it. And so when you are there, what you see is that those granite domes are actually completely flat now, but those greenstone belts, they've been silicified and been hardened, so they're actually quite hard. They're actually harder to weather. So they're actually forming the topography. So you have these hills of greenstone belts surrounding these giant flat granite beds, and it almost looks like an impact structure. It's not. Absolutely. So yeah, you need to think about geology and topography in a much different way. It's really cool. Fascinating.
So some of these areas like Australia, have they been sort of isolated from geology for quite a long time? Have these been at the surface for a significant amount of time?
That actually is a very good question. I would say yes, they have. How long exactly, I actually don't know, to be fair. But hundreds of millions, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I guess that's why they're so well preserved then, because they basically haven't been in the geological cycle for such a long time.
Another way you can think about it as why they've been preserved is that they were probably at the very core of these previous continents. So that when you have plate tectonic, what's going to get destroyed is actually the plate edge. So these continents, what is remaining now is probably the very core of these ancient continents that we have. Yeah,
that's awesome.
So how do you destroy part of a continent?
You would make it by subduction zone, essentially, where the plate boundary would, you would recycle. All your sedimentary basin on the continental shelves actually end up being subducted eventually. So that's how you would do that.
Okay. So it's just the most buoyant cores that end up surviving effectively, or
over billions of years. Yeah, you would know. Like these are the because that's the thing that it's in the inside, and you eat it from the edge inside, from the outside in. So yeah, that's the stuff that is not being eaten yet, I guess. You give it another 3 billion, it probably will be gone.
So should we go back in time a bit? Not quite 3 billion years, but I understand you've travelled quite a bit for work then.
I have, yeah.
America, New Zealand,
yes.
Wales.
Wales, yeah, Wales was the latest version, yeah. So in my career, I've been very fortunate to be able to move around quite a bit. So when I finished my PhD, I did my PhD in France. I finished in 2007, and I was, I had the opportunity through a research fellowship to move to New Zealand. Initially for a year, I ended up staying 5, and I was based in Wellington, and it was a great experience, absolutely. And then it was after 5 years, I thought, okay, this is time for me to move on and explore other things scientifically. And so that's how I ended up in Chicago for about a year and a half, and then got another opportunity of a research fellowship in Durham. So that's how I ended up in the UK about 6 years ago. So I stayed there for about 2.5 years, working there with Helen Williams, who's now in Cambridge. And then the position opened in Cardiff to build a lab there. So I applied for it and got it. And I was very fortunate as well there that on the same day they hired another isotope geochemist called Morten Andersen, who's looking at similar things to me, but more from a surface perspective. So he looks at Archean oceans and ancient oceans and oxygenation of the oceans. So actually we both very complementary, so I was very fortunate that we actually both got hired to build the lab. It has been a great experience so far.
Have you enjoyed moving around so much?
It has been, it's not easy because you are, far away from friends and family. But it has been, I personally enjoyed it very much. Yes, I think I've been very fortunate in that regard that I've been able to move around. It's been extremely enjoyable for me.
Yeah, I guess it's one of the sort of big potential sort of benefits of academia that you are free to move around like this and while you're young and explore other countries and stuff, which is really cool.
Absolutely, it's it's really also opens your mind a bit, and bearing that in mind, I've had the personal opportunity as well to do this. I didn't have anyone to care for, so yes, it's not always easy.
Yes, no,
and in a way, I think research funders should actually provide more opportunity for people to actually stay locally. Mm-hmm. It's great to be going around, and absolutely research is international. You need to be able to collaborate internationally. Yeah. But there are ways to do this without having to move abroad. Mm-hmm. I've been able to do it. It was great. But there should be more opportunities in the current landscape to actually allow people to not have to move around too much.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, we've got one final question that we tend to ask all our guests that come on. So our final question really is, if you could be doing something other than academia, what other sort of career paths do you think you might have taken?
So when I was in high school and I was, I hesitated as to what I should do at university. Actually, I hesitated in being a physiotherapist.
Oh, really? Cool.
Yes. I think, taking back 20 years now ago, I probably would have taken that path if there hasn't been for geology. I don't know how that would turn out, but yeah. So it was,
that's an important thing to do, I guess. That's pretty cool.
What was it about you, about physiotherapy that drew you to it?
Do you know what? I can't remember. I was, I'm quite into sport, and I think that was kind of the idea of, being, I was not a naturally able, very able sportsman, so that was the other way of getting into that, I guess. That's,
Awesome. That's pretty cool. So if I've got a bad back, I know to come to then.
Maybe, yeah.
Cool, fantastic. Well, we'll put some links of your papers in the description if you out there want to read a bit more about titanium and continental crust formation. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
If you're ever in Manchester again, you'll feel free to pop back on. It's been a real pleasure, good conversation. But until next week, I'll say goodbye and see you later.